Our protagonist had an exceptional talent with a sword. There was nothing he couldn't learn, and nothing could escape his blade. He worked so hard that he often had bloodstains on his palms. After dropping out of high school, he spent 20 years honing his skills with a knife, becoming the best swordsman in the country. The waiter shouted that Table three's amiche corsa was ready in the busy restaurant. The waiters heard an alarm inside the kitchen, momentarily pausing their work. Meanwhile, our protagonist was inside the kitchen, wearing ear pads, focused on cutting a fish. One of the waiters excused himself and approached him, saying the phone alarm had been going off. Our protagonist realized he'd set it to vibrate. When he looked at his phone, he saw a notification from a game, making him wonder if it was the one he had deleted earlier and if something was wrong with it. The waiter informed him that a guest had arrived, to which our protagonist instructed the waiter to say he wasn't there. Moments later, a man entered the kitchen and pointed out that he wasn't buying the excuse. A chubby man entered, stating that it was time for our protagonist to give his answer. He believed he'd given our protagonist enough time to think and insisted it shouldn't be a difficult request for someone who handles swords daily. When our protagonist didn't respond, the chubby man laughed and accused him of being insensitive. He ordered his men to bring forward a suitcase, saying the requester should show sincerity first. A man opened the suitcase, revealing it was full of money. The chubby man proudly announced it was an advanced payment of $300 million, and if our protagonist completed the task properly, there would be more. Without a word, the protagonist swiftly swung his knife, slicing through a large fish hanging in front of him, horrifying the chubby man. The protagonist calmly told him that the kitchen was a place where cleanliness was paramount, and it wasn't for someone as dirty as the chubby man. He then ordered him to leave. As pieces of fish slammed onto the floor, the chubby man, stunned, shouted that the protagonist really was the sword saint, as he had expected. He grabbed a sharper knife from the counter in anger, making his men step back in fear. The chubby man, along with his bodyguards, stormed out of the kitchen before leaving the restaurant. The chubby man warned the protagonist not to think he was giving up, promising he'd be back soon. Later, after the restaurant had closed, the protagonist was out back smoking. His coworker joined him, saying the down payment was $300 million, and that if it were him, he would have accepted it on the spot. The coworker asked why he turned it down. The protagonist replied that all his life he had only sliced fish heads with a knife and asked his coworker what he knew about being a thug. His coworker suggested that he was just using his reputation as a sword master and wondered if he was seriously planning to kill someone. He advised the protagonist to scare them enough to get the money, buy a house, and open a shop, telling him he needed to live like a human too. But the protagonist simply replied that even if they offered billions, he would still pass. Suddenly, his phone received another notification. His coworker teased him, asking if he was dating someone because of all the notifications. The protagonist replied that it was a game. His coworker asked if he was still playing Divine Protection, to which he admitted he quit. Just then, someone called out, asking where they were going without cleaning up. His coworker told him it was their boss and that he was leaving first. Alone, the protagonist smoked, thinking back to when he was young. His family went bankrupt, and since then, he'd been working non-stop. He guessed he'd been too focused on earning money, but his phone kept buzzing, the notifications becoming excessive. Annoyed, he pulled out his phone, wondering why it kept ringing. He briefly thought he might have reinstalled the game after a night of drinking, deciding to delete it again. He chuckled when he saw a message about the Demon King's invasion of the Academy, knowing those guys had been invading the Academy for years. But then, accidentally, he clicked on the game. It opened with a welcome song, and the game prompted him to touch the screen to enter. Nostalgic, he noted that the soundtrack was still the same, and the female characters were still as beautiful as ever. Suddenly, the screen became corrupted. Was it lag? Before he could react, a bright, powerful light shot out of the phone, sucking him in. Moments later, his coworker came out of the restaurant looking for him. The coworker saw the protagonist's phone lying on the ground and wondered where he had gone, puzzled that he left his phone behind. The boss yelled from inside, asking where the chef was. The coworker, unaware of what had happened, joked that it seemed like the chef went to the bathroom, not knowing he had been sucked into the game. Now, with a 100% transfer complete displayed on the screen, there was nothing special about the game, just a typical pay-to-win model with an auto-hunting system, a mass-produced mobile game that needed no further explanation. Our protagonist played it for one reason. He was captivated by the female character's appearances. He got swallowed up by the game, finding it ironic that he ended up spending a fortune on it. After playing through multiple cycles, he wasn't even a playable character anymore, not even an NPC. Instead, he became a background character whose whereabouts were unknown in that world. His name was Kang Guillaume. One day, he accidentally bumped into someone, and when he turned around, surprised, he saw it was a woman. He quickly asked if she was okay, and she replied that she was fine. Fortunately for him, the game Divine Protection was set in Korea. The names, locations, and geography were all the same, with only minor differences in a few characters. The similarities helped him adapt easily, and for a year, he lived in that world, forgetting whether it was a game or reality, enjoying a life he couldn't experience in his previous one. That was until that fateful day. He returned to his apartment, where his parents welcomed him, calling him their pride, the great swordmaster, and showed him an acceptance letter to a prestigious academy. He asked his parents if they could put it away, but they insisted, saying no matter how many times they saw it, they were proud of how well they had raised him. His mother then asked if he had packed everything, to which he replied that he'd finish soon. His mother excitedly told him to go ahead. That day, his modest dream of living a normal life shattered into pieces. He sighed in his room, knowing the day was almost here. He had asked countless times if he could avoid it, but nothing changed. Tired, he began packing his things, thinking about how happy everyone was. He couldn't refuse. Looking at their family photo, he wondered how Kang Guillaume had gotten accepted into such a prestigious school. His father once told him that his divine power had manifested last year, and he took the entrance exam right after. His mother had asked if he didn't remember. Before he possessed Kang Guillaume, that divine power had already appeared, allowing him to pass the entrance exam to Hoken Academy. Staring at the acceptance letter, he wondered if the real Kang Guillaume was a genius. Divine power was a special ability that humans could use, much like skills in a game. However, not all humans possessed divine power, as it was usually inherited genetically. Society was divided into 3 segments based on this: the privileged, the commoners, and the poor. Hoken Academy was born to maintain the power of the elite. Though it was established under the pretense of hero cultivation, it had long since become a school exclusive to upper-class families. Recently, a special admission system was introduced for non-hero families, and Kang Guillaume was admitted as one of those students. He wondered why heroes were still necessary, though he knew the answer. The Demon King. He mused that this world wasn't reality, but training heroes for war felt too real. It reminded him of what it would feel like to re-enlist. He called forth his divine power, and a system window popped up in front of him, still feeling unfamiliar. Looking at the divine power Kang Guillaume had unlocked, he saw it was painlessness, which reduced pain for 30 seconds with a 12-hour cooldown. He couldn't believe he had crossed into this world with something so underwhelming. Every time he saw it, it depressed him. It was nonsense. But then he remembered the divine power he had been granted when he possessed Kang Guillaume's body, the blessing of the sword god. Its activation time was infinite, without a cooldown, but it only worked with a sword less than 30 centimeters long and 5 centimeters wide. He was in disbelief. He had the blessing of the sword god, and his name, Kang Guillaume, literally meant blood demon. He wondered if the universe was playing a joke on him. He'd never encountered such a blessing in the game and thought the elaborate name clashed with the ridiculously simple effect. it seemed absurd to even call it a divine power, but what stood out most was the activation condition. A sword less than 30 centimeters long and less than 5 centimeters wide. It was clearly referring to a sashimi knife. Were they implying he should cut sashimi in this world too? Frustrated, he realized life never went as planned. He then asked himself if he had packed everything. Suddenly, he remembered he had forgotten his equipment. In the game, even the lowest grade E rank weapon cost tens of millions of won, while an average C rank cost hundreds of millions. That meant A rank and S rank items were treasures in themselves. He knew the tuition alone was exorbitant, and he didn't want to spend money on something he was being pushed into. Yet, the academy required equipment, and if he showed up without anything, he'd leave a bad impression on the first day. Sighing, he decided to visit Daxo. As he stood up and walked out of his room, he recalled his first master, who insisted on using a Japanese sashimi knife worth over 100 million won, often saying a true master never blames their equipment. On the day of the entrance ceremony, where the students' equipment was inspected, he stood in uniform, staring at the instructor in confusion. The instructor looked at the sashimi knives on the counter and asked if they were really his weapons. He replied calmly, "Yes." The instructor, thinking it was a prank pulled by upper-class students, felt the need to establish discipline. He then shouted, asking if the academy was a joke, and if the student truly believed a kitchen knife was an acceptable weapon for the class placement test. Remaining composed, he simply repeated, "It's my weapon." The instructor, stunned for a moment, angrily addressed him as student, but he calmly explained he was a special student from a modest family. The tuition alone must have been a huge burden on his parents, and he couldn't possibly afford an expensive weapon on top of that. Hearing his explanation, the instructor noticed the color of his tag, which indicated his status as a special admission student, those from non-upper-class backgrounds. Understanding the financial burden of the tuition, the instructor was taken aback. He found it shocking that an institution supposedly promoting equal education rights would push away such a sincere, filial student. The young man then spoke with gravity, saying, "Blaming your equipment is something only amateurs do." The instructor froze for a moment, knowing the phrase, "A master never blames their tools." Such words didn't seem fitting for a teenage boy, and the instructor felt that Jiam had already reached mastery in some aspect of life. His unyielding spirit carried the weight of someone who had lived far beyond his years. It was almost as if a god stood before him. With that, the instructor approved his weapon, and Jiam thanked him. Meanwhile, some upper-class students glared at Jiam in anger, outraged that a special admission student like him had even made it to the academy. They whispered among themselves, asking how someone like him could possibly belong there. But before any commotion could arise, the instructor shouted for them to be quiet and told the students that once the evaluation was over, they were to move swiftly and promptly. As Guillaume walked past the line, the instructor sternly reminded everyone that, depending on their actions, he could be their angel or their devil. Hearing this, Guillaume felt a wave of post-traumatic stress disorder from his past as the words echoed in his mind. A moment later, Guillaume decided to take a break and sat down on a bench, reflecting. He expected hostility, but still found it unsettling to experience firsthand. Regardless, he had completed the equipment inspection and survived the entrance ceremony. Now, the only thing left was the class placement exam. Looking around at the academy, he still couldn't believe he had made it here. This was the school he'd be attending for the next 3 years. The Hero Training School, Hoken Academy. As he took in the impressive size of the campus, he thought it was much grander than the game's graphics had shown. If he exaggerated, it felt as large as a small town. Smiling to himself, he felt a sense of surrealism. He was attending a school meant for the upper class, something unimaginable back when he had to drop out of high school due to his family's financial struggles on Earth. Suddenly, an announcement instructed students to gather at the training hall by 1 p.m. for the class placement exam. He opened his bag, knowing the entrance ceremony was over, but also knowing the real challenge lay in the placement exam. Looking at his sashimi knife, he reminded himself that an exam is still an exam, and he'd need to familiarize himself with it. He realized he hadn't used a knife since arriving in this world, because he hadn't needed to. Memories of his master came flooding back, reminding him that, even for a single day, one must never put down their knife. His master had even told him to hold it while sleeping. Jiam chuckled, thinking he had absorbed another one of his master's habits. But he also wondered if a year's break from wielding the blade had dulled his skills. Despite living by the knife for 20 years, he then untied the knife slightly, feeling its edge. A small smile appeared on his face as he realized the blade was in better condition than he had expected. Deciding to test it, he fully removed the cover, planning to cut a few practice strokes. But as soon as the cover came off completely, a powerful energy surged from his hand and flowed through the entire sashimi knife. The system notification flashed before him. Weapon meets activation conditions. The blessing of the sword god is activated. But just as he processed that, another message appeared. The level of the physical body and weapon is too low. Suppression activated to initiate synchronization. In shock and disbelief, he could barely think. All he had done was draw the knife, and yet the blessing of the sword god had already activated. The system displayed a message. Synchronization complete. May the blessing of the gods be with you. Suddenly, he felt an unbearable surge of power and screamed in agony as the blessing of the sword god activated within him. The energy crawled through his body, causing excruciating pain. He knew that if it continued, he would die. But the power didn't stop. All he could do was endure. Suddenly, a bright, powerful light exploded in front of him. When he opened his eyes, the school around him had shattered like glass. Stunned, he stood in shock, wondering what the hell was happening. His grip on the knife loosened, and as soon as it hit the ground, the shattered world restored itself, leaving him even more surprised. He realized that the moment he let go of the knife, everything returned to normal. Suddenly, his head and body throbbed with pain. He understood that the divine power had activated, but he wondered if the world-breaking effect had something to do with the sword god's blessing. The backlash from the activation was immense, and he knew that his divine power of painlessness could only help with mild muscle soreness, not this kind of overwhelming pain. He looked at his shaking hand, realizing that if every activation felt like this, the power was unusable. An announcement rang out, instructing students to gather at the training hall immediately. He debated whether he should pick the knife back up. He couldn't just leave a sashimi knife lying on the ground, and he tried to comfort himself by thinking maybe it only hurt during the first activation. Nervously, he reached for the knife, wondering if he'd be okay. The moment he touched it, he screamed again as the power surged through him. In agony, he shouted, "What the hell is this?" Meanwhile, in the training hall, students were gathering and the professors were mingling, laughing, and discussing how much they had spent on their children's admission. One of the professors noticed a figure and commented to another, "Look, Clint has made quite the journey." The 7-star hero, Sigrid von Neum, was standing nearby. The others greeted him, recognizing him as a descendant of Aaron Neum and the direct disciple of the founding hero, Valor Jin. Sigrid, however, remained silent, staring at them, which made the professors feel awkward as they returned to their seats. Sigrid sighed and glanced beside him as someone approached. The 7-star hero, Sage Medea Poison, greeted him, saying it had been a while and asked if it had really been half a century. He replied that he could see she still hadn't started dressing like an academy director and joked that turning 70 hadn't changed her much. She teased back, saying every woman wants to remain beautiful until they die, and offered to make him look 10 years younger with her blessing. He dismissed her offer, remarking that despite her upcoming 70th birthday, she still hadn't grown up and humans should value their inner nature. Playfully, she called him an old fart and pointed out how he hadn't changed in 50 years, which annoyed him, prompting him to call her an old hag. Smiling, she teased that he had changed a lot if he was willing to attend events like these, and he grumbled that he used to hate even breathing the same air as the egoistic bastards present. She guessed his granddaughter must be quite pretty to have made him attend. Sigrid stayed quiet and mentioned that it looked like things were about to start. Meanwhile, in the center of the training hall, students were chatting and introducing themselves. Jiam stood silently, observing them. He wondered if he was the only one with black hair and if he was the only special admission student among the nobles. He remembered the students from the equipment inspection, how they had glared at him with disdain. The memory made him feel lowly and out of place. Suddenly, everyone's attention shifted to someone entering the hall. A bright, radiant presence moved through the crowd, and Jiam's eyes widened in shock as he saw who it was. Every man she passed seemed entranced by her, but Jiam knew better. She was Abel von Neum, the granddaughter of the Sword Emperor and the main heroine of the game. The very reason he had spent a fortune on it. The subspace, created by the ancestral hero Valor Jin, was a dimension formed alongside the establishment of the Academy. It was a reality separate from their own, where the rules of the real world did not apply. Even murder was overlooked. Sigrid asked Medea if the theme for the event was a subspace battle royale. She confirmed, explaining that subspace battles were a tradition at their school. However, this year, they were trying something different with a battle royale format, where participants would be split into groups of 10. Sigrid remarked that it meant it was a survival game. Medea responded that there were no restrictions on equipment, to which Sigrid commented that it would just be a free-for-all for the privileged types with access to better gear. Medea quickly told him not to bring it up, explaining that she had compromised as much as she could. She also added that, whether he liked it or not, the Academy was mostly funded by nobility, and she had gone through a lot of trouble just to introduce the new system. Jiam's attention shifted to Abel, noticing how unnervingly beautiful she was. He thought of her as a character out of a 2D game, but realized it was something more. He mused that the men who tried to approach her were fools. Had he not known better, he might have done the same. Having played the game to some extent, he knew Abel was a player with the miracle blessing, meaning she was tied to the game's protagonist. He reflected that beautiful people always had someone by their side, and someone like him, a special student, was not on their level. He preferred avoiding involvement to prevent a noisy school life. As he pulled out his book, he recalled the 3 principles he had set for his future. Complete his studies without incident, secure a conventional job, and live a safe life. The book mentioned that the most coveted occupation was hero, offering an extremely high salary, which made him wonder what kind of hardships came with it. Remembering how even the sight of a knife made him tremble, he closed the book, thinking that heroes should protect the world while he found a more comfortable job. An announcement suddenly echoed, informing students that the class assignment exam for the 783rd Academy was starting. It explained that this year's exam, as previously announced, would be a battle royale among the 10 randomly assigned cadets. The first place winner would be assigned to the Star class, second and third places to the Dragon class, and 8th to 10th places to the Ordinary class. The class assignments would be based on these results. Scores would be automatically assigned, and there was no time limit. Yam noticed it was just like the game, and his goal was to secure a spot in the Ordinary class, so he planned to finish quickly. The subspace generation device activated, consuming everyone as they entered the subspace. The exam began with the system wishing them the blessings of the heroes. Jiam resolved to avoid using his knife if possible. A short while later, students were being evaluated by the system as they exited subspace, securing their class rankings. Meanwhile, others were still fighting inside. Medea told Sigrid that because of his granddaughter's bloodline from the Neum and Gallum families, her results would be significant. Sigrid simply asked why she was bringing it up now. Medea pointed out an impressive time of 7 minutes and 14 seconds, achieved with a C-rank weapon. Sigrid noted that Abel sought a fair assessment. Medea responded that, although Abel was a stickler for fairness, she still ranked among the top 10 in the Academy's history. Sigrid proudly stated that this was only natural, given the bloodline of Neum, and stood up, announcing it seemed to be wrapping up, so he was leaving. Medea informed him there was still one group left, but Sigrid dismissed them as offspring of the pigs and walked away, saying he would see her next time. Medea cryptically replied that she would see him in the afterlife. Suddenly, a powerful sensation stopped both of them in their tracks, and everyone felt it. Medea asked Sigrid if he sensed it too, and he replied that it was unbelievable. He scanned the stage and the surroundings, noting there wasn't a place in the entire building where that sensation wasn't felt. Then, once again, they experienced a surge of immense power and saw the subspace above them tear open. Both stood in shock as they witnessed the subspace shattering into pieces. Two students were thrown from it, leaving the crowd stunned. The students crashed onto the stage, shattering the ground on impact. No one could believe that people had fallen out of subspace. Then, a brilliant light appeared above them once more, prompting Secret to look up in concern. Something fell from the subspace and pierced the ground near one of the collapsed students. Medea quickly called for the medical staff to check the vitals of the cadets who had emerged. Meanwhile, the sashimi knife near Guillaume had shined brightly before the confrontation. He was facing his teammate, muttering, "Bastard," thinking that the results were inevitable and predetermined. However, just as the thought crossed his mind, their enemy grabbed his teammate and slammed him into the wall, shattering it to pieces. Guillaume stared at his squad, realizing, unfortunately, that he had been caught in the squad of death. He knew their enemies were the infamous twins of malevolence from the Iron King family, Mao Jun and Ma Shun. Though they possessed innate talent, their brutality and deceit knew no bounds. He was furious that these bastards had been toying with them for 30 minutes, and he wondered if he appeared so weak that he wasn't even worth their attention. Shun glanced at the man in his grasp, realizing he was dead, and tossed the body aside. Bored, he began counting the students he had killed, asking Jun how many were left. As Jun stepped on a student's neck, Shun noted the student was still alive, but Jun simply crushed him to death, replying that it was more or less over. Shun, annoyed, reminded Jun that he had caught 4 of them. Jun apologized, pointing to the side and telling Shun he could have that one. Shun turned to look at the trembling girl and agreed, saying he would accept it. Watching in disbelief, Jiam noticed that the girl, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, seemed to be in a panic, her will to fight entirely gone. As Shun approached the girl, he teasingly told his brother, Jun, to look at her, commenting that she was to his taste and expressing curiosity about the sound of her screams. Shun excitedly shouted that he was dying to find out, while the girl remained frozen in fear. Jun, half-jokingly, told Shun that even though he was his little brother, he was such a pervert. Shun then began scaring the girl, asking where he should start tearing her apart. At that moment, Jiam shouted at the twins, calling them bastards to get their attention. He demanded to know why they were going so far, even in subspace, and asked if they were psychopaths. But then he realized too late that he had stepped forward without thinking. Shun, amused, asked Jun if there was one more student left. Jun pointed out Jiam's name tag and remarked that he was a special student, which, to them, was a lowly bastard. The brothers turned to stare at him, smiling creepily. Shun, still grinning, told Jun he would take care of him quickly. Jun agreed, reminding Shun to rip out his tongue since he had insulted them. Shun, still laughing, said he would, walking closer to Guillaume. Panicking, Guillaume frantically considered what to do. He wondered if he should use the blessing of painlessness, but then realized that since the twins had been desecrating corpses for 30 minutes, avoiding pain for just 30 seconds wouldn't help. Suddenly, a bright light shone from his bag, surprising him. He remembered the sashimi knife he had inside, but he knew that holding the sword would activate the blessing of the sword god. He hadn't even made it half a day since deciding to live an ordinary, uneventful, and safe life. Shun noticed him reaching into his bag and mockingly asked what it was. When Jiam pulled out the sashimi knife, the twins were stunned for a moment before bursting into laughter. They couldn't believe it and taunted him, asking if it was a joke. The girl, watching in terror, stood frozen in fear. Guillaume adjusted his stance, shouting that since he was at least a little amusing, he would make his death as painless as possible. Shun then leaped into the air, appearing above him and shouting that he would smash his head first. Realizing he couldn't be picky, Jiam opened his legs wide and hoped for the best. He activated the blessing of painlessness for 30 seconds, along with the blessing of the sword god, while removing the knife's cover. He knew that painlessness would counteract the pain caused by the blessing of the sword god for 30 seconds. As Shun launched his robotic hand towards him, tauntingly asking what he could possibly do with a pathetic knife like that, Guillaume knew that if he couldn't cut, he would die. He worried about the sashimi knife's ability to cut through Shun's heavy equipment, thinking that Shun wasn't a fish but a person. He remembered once asking his master why gangsters in movies wielded sashimi knives, wondering if they really used them to cut people and not just fish. His master had called him a crazy bastard, telling him it was only in movies and that even a god couldn't make it work. But he added that if he slashed it right, it would still cut. As the power of the sword god surged through his body, a strong, bright light was released. Guillaume swung the knife, slashing at Shun's arm just as Shun yelled at him to get lost. Shun was shocked to see his arm severed, and it fell, slamming to the ground in front of Guillaume. Back when Guillaume was still on Earth, he once called his boss to ask about gangsters. In the middle of the call, a sharp object was suddenly thrown at him. He shook in fear as he realized it was a knife now lodged in the wall behind him. The man reminded him to call him master, and asked why he was curious about such things. Guillaume knew that his first master had been a former thug. As atonement, the man had cut off one of his own wrists and later opened a sashimi restaurant, saying he wanted to bring happiness to people through his knife skills. His master's skills were indeed impressive. Curious, Guillaume asked his master why gangsters in movies always wield sashimi knives. He wondered if it was like that in real life too. His master replied sharply, telling him that someone with experience and knife skills shouldn't be asking such questions. He explained that if someone stabbed a person with a wide chef's knife, the skin would immediately contract. His master then asked if Guillaume thought it would even come out easily. He explained that a sashimi knife, being narrow, could stab multiple times and be withdrawn effortlessly. When Guillaume asked why they didn't just slice since they could slice fish, his master yelled that fish could be sliced because they lay down still. If they were standing, he wouldn't even be able to slice bread in one go. He then mentioned that in manga, it always looked like a clean slice. His master hit him on the back, reminding him to call him master, not boss, and told him that even if the god of knives were involved, it wouldn't work that way. But in his current situation, as Guillaume sliced Shun's arm with the sashimi knife, it worked perfectly. Shun was in shock, staring at his falling arm alongside his brother Jun, while the girl looked on in stunned disbelief. When Shun's arm hit the ground, the pain hit him all at once and he screamed in agony. Shun cried out for his lost arm, pleading for help as he saw his opponent approaching him. Stammering, Shun shouted at Guillaume to stay away, but Guillaume continued to advance. Shun, now in terror, turned and ran, screaming for someone to help him. Jun, frozen in horror, watched as his younger brother tried to flee. When Shun neared his brother, Guillaume moved swiftly, slicing Shun's head cleanly in half with terrifying ease. Jun, paralyzed by the sight, stared in disbelief at his brother's severed head. He screamed out Shun's name, filled with both rage and sorrow. Meanwhile, Guillaume stood silently, and the girl continued to watch, wide-eyed and shocked. Jun reminded himself that this was subspace, and that Shun wasn't really dead. He tried to calm down, thinking that his brother's death didn't matter here. But as he stared at Shun's lifeless body, he noticed something odd. His opponent seemed like someone who had just used a knife on a person for the first time. He also noticed Guillaume's ragged breath and trembling, wondering if the events were just a coincidence. Regardless, Jun realized he needed to watch out for that knife. Grabbing Shun's hand equipment, Jun thought his brother's downfall had been due to carelessness. He put the equipment on his own arm and shouted that the weapons were at their best when used with both hands. Jun then activated the Blessing of Resolution, which amplified his defense. The Blessing of Intervention, which increased his jump power by 200%, and the Blessing of Spirit, which significantly boosted the power of his punches. Confidently, Jun yelled that those were A-rank blessings that commoners could only dream of. He taunted Guillaume, saying that even an S-rank weapon wouldn't be able to pierce his armor, and that he wasn't like his little brother, Shun. Meanwhile, Guillaume was enduring the pain, quietly counting down from 23. Jun launched himself forward, shouting that Guillaume had been standing there dumbfounded the whole time. He asked mockingly if Guillaume was mumbling his last words. Laughing, Jun declared he would smash his head in. But Guillaume didn't even flinch. When there were only 6 seconds left in his countdown, Jun was suddenly cut to pieces, stabbed repeatedly with the sashimi knife. Jun shook in agony, slowly dying. Jiam remained in the same position, still counting down. At the final second, just as Jun died, he wondered in his last moments what kind of being his opponent was. As the countdown reached 0, the system notified Jiam that the effect of the blessing of painlessness had ended. He screamed in pain, clutching the sashimi knife. Later, he opened his eyes and saw that he was in a room. He asked himself if it was a hospital and sat up, feeling pain coursing through his body. Just then, a man entered the room. Upon seeing him awake, the man immediately stepped out, reporting that Jiam had regained consciousness. This surprised Jiam. Soon after, several people entered the room and he was stunned. These were faces he had never seen in person before, but somehow recognized. He remembered, 50 years ago, these were the same people who defeated the Demon Lord's 6th Legion commander. They were the 7-star heroes, the strongest of mankind. Secret and the Academy's head, Sage Medea Poison. He wondered why on earth they were here. Secret was the first to speak, asking him for his name. He replied, Kang Guillaume. But Secret, with a serious expression, quickly cut to the point, asking him, "What on earth did you do?" Kang Guillaume hesitated, knowing that the sensation he had felt during the battle wasn't just in his imagination. It was real. He looked at Secret and noticed he was holding a sword, realizing the gravity of being noticed by such a monstrous figure. Guillaume responded, "Even if it was a pocket dimension, I judged that the twins' actions went too far. Still, I think my response was excessive, so I'll accept any punishment without complaint." He then stared back at Secret, who was still fixated on him. Medea broke the silence, calling Secret an old fool and asking him how he planned to handle a young one. She leaned in closer to Guillaume, adding that even though Secret spoke harshly, it was he who had cleared Guillaume's blocked blood vessels while he was unconscious. With a playful tone, she commented, "They say people only get more stubborn with age," and sweetly asked him to give her a break for the sake of her face. Secret, clearly flustered, shouted at Medea, reminding her not to mention it. Medea hugged him, teasing, "The old fool is embarrassed," leaving Guillaume wondering why Secret had done such a thing for him. It dawned on Guillaume why his body felt so light, or perhaps as damp as a wet feather. Medea, meanwhile, gazed happily at his shoulders with a gleam of excitement. Medea explained that while he was unconscious, they extracted the footage of what happened and watched it with the staff. The sight of him throwing himself to protect that poor female student made him look like a hero straight out of a fairy tale. She then playfully added, "You were literally the prince she dreamt of. You're the prince himself." Before Secret could interrupt her, Medea became irritated and insisted she show some dignity. Though Medea didn't seem too bothered, she went on to explain that they weren't going to make an issue out of his actions during the exam, so he didn't need to worry. Honestly, those twins from the Mao family only got into the academy by buttering up the elders, but they had said they would withdraw on their own. Guillaume felt a wave of relief wash over him, realizing he wouldn't have to deal with them at school anymore. Medea then told him that they had come to deliver some news. He asked what it was, and Medea smiled, replying, "You were the top scorer," and congratulated him. Guillaume blinked in disbelief, asking what they meant by that. He couldn't believe it. His vision of a safe, sound, and secure future was fading away before his eyes. A moment later, in Medea's office, she told Secret that in her nearly 20 years as head of the academy, this was the first time something like this had ever happened. She recalled Guillaume's response when he said he didn't like being the top scorer, which shocked both of them. She asked if he understood what it meant to be in the star class, reminding him that while the elders were furious, the top cadet's decision was based on a result directly graded by the space itself. He thought for a moment but still replied that he didn't like it, prompting her to ask again if he truly didn't understand. Secret, meanwhile, silently observed the exchange. Secret snapped back to attention when Medea addressed him directly, asking if he was upset that Guillaume took the top spot instead of his granddaughter. She reminded him that he had seen the footage himself. He replied that it was foolish to question the judgment of the subspace, which was imbued with the will of the founding hero. The Academy had chosen Guillaume as the top cadet, and they should simply follow that decision. Secret reflected that if Guillaume's skills had been outstanding, he would have understood. If Guillaume's physical abilities were exceptional, he would have accepted it. If his experience had been remarkable, he would have agreed. But what he saw in this young boy, who had barely reached adulthood, was something more. His movements embodied a concept, a swordsmanship that Secret had pursued his entire life, a level of mastery. Yet the unsettling feeling he had when he unblocked Jiam's meridians lingered. Jiam's body, soft and unconditioned as though it had never undergone training, seemed to contain something that shouldn't have been there. Secret sighed, realizing that even at his age, he couldn't believe he still had such a competitive spirit, especially toward a boy of the same age as his granddaughter. Secret was startled again when he heard Medea praising Jiam's delicate features and the way he heroically cut down enemies to save a woman in distress. She added that if she were just 10 years younger, or even now, she wondered if she could still try to win him over. She asked Secret what he thought, but he simply responded by asking if she knew what cadets call girls like her these days. Intrigued, Medea urged him to continue, daring him to open his big mouth. When she asked him again what they called someone like her, he sat down his coffee cup, making her even more excited. Calmly, he told her, "They call you a Medea, enraged, stood up and attacked Secret, shaking the entire room. The next day, Jiam arrived at his wolf class. He knew it was the best compromise he could have made. He remembered how Medea had ordered someone to send him to the upper class, but he insisted on joining the tiger class. Medea had shouted that the top cadet couldn't be sent to the tiger class, but he had argued back, questioning why not when the academy prided itself on equality. Medea had responded that, despite that, the tiger class was off limits, and instead, she promised to keep his request a secret. Knowing that if the elders found out, they would cause an even bigger fuss, Guillaume sighed as he opened the classroom door, frustrated because his plan had been to quietly complete his studies in a lower class without getting caught up in the power struggles of the upper ranks. At least this arrangement was still within his expectations. As he entered, the door suddenly slammed shut, causing a loud noise. He looked around and noticed his classmates staring at him. They stared for a moment, but when they saw the color of his name tag, they quickly averted their gaze and returned to their usual activities. As he walked to his seat, he thought to himself that they should keep ignoring him just as he preferred. When he finally sat down, he was amazed that everyone was completely ignoring him. He figured that Master Medea had managed to keep things under wraps. Feeling relieved, he happily pulled out his book, thinking that being a loner had its perks. Maybe this was a good thing. But just as he began to settle in, he heard someone approaching. When he looked to his side, he saw the girl from the subspace exam. She thanked him for what he did back then. He stared at her silently for a moment, realizing he didn't remember her. She quickly reminded him that she was the girl from the exam. He found it odd that she was using such formal language when they were the same age, and replied that there was no need to thank him, as anyone would have done the same in that situation. Although it seemed like he had saved her, he knew deep down he was only trying to survive and felt hypocritical. He then mentioned that they hadn't properly introduced themselves, introducing himself as Kang Jiam. She responded that her name was Chloe. He said it was nice to meet her, still surprised they ended up in the same class. She greeted him in return, while he quietly wondered who she really was. He had played through most of the game's story, but he didn't recognize her name. As far as he knew, the later stages of the game focused on the battle against the demon tribe, so it was unexpected to meet a new character now. Then he realized that Chloe might just be a background character like him. Jiam asked if she could keep what happened during the exam a secret, to which she immediately agreed. She seemed about to say something else when a teacher entered, loudly instructing everyone to take their seats. Jiam told Chloe they could talk later, and she nodded in agreement. The teacher congratulated them on their admission and told them they should be proud, as they were all chosen to carry on the will of the founding hero, Valor Joachim. He introduced himself as Lee W. Bin, the chief instructor of the wolf class. Lee explained that since it was their first day, they would start with some basic physical training and instructed them to change into their training clothes and gather at the training ground in 30 minutes. When one student asked what the training would be, Lee replied it was simple: 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, followed by 10 laps around the training ground. He then shouted for everyone to change and gather, to which they all responded with a resounding, "Yes!" As the students began to file out of the room, Jiam stayed seated, wondering if the training was designed to turn cadets into bald-headed soldiers. He approached Lee, who asked what was on his mind. Guillaume, hoping to find a way out of the tedious training, replied that he was feeling a bit sick. Lee thought for a moment before telling him that, as the top cadet, the basic training wouldn't be very useful for him. He suggested that Guillaume attend STAR class training on his first day, mentioning that the headmaster had granted him permission to attend all classes. Shocked, Guillaume thought to himself, "Medea, you damn old hag." Laughing it off, Guillaume quickly said that he just needed to use the restroom urgently and was only feeling a bit sore. Lee chuckled and replied that he appreciated Guillaume's straightforwardness, saying he would see him at the training ground, to which Guillaume replied, "Yes." Later, as Guillaume ran around the training ground, he was utterly exhausted. Lee shouted at the group that this was just light work and that they should move faster, but Guillaume found himself falling behind, feeling like he was dying. Just then, Chloe appeared beside him, asking if the training was too difficult since he looked unwell. He laughed weakly, replying that he was fine. She asked what lap he was on, and he guessed it was his 5th. Surprised, he asked her what lap she was on, as she seemed to be running behind as well. To his shock, she replied that she was on her 9th lap. She then encouraged him to keep going, shouting that he could do it, before speeding off, leaving Guillaume suffering and exhausted. Days later, in Guillaume's dorm room, empty water bottles littered the floor and surfaces. He slammed another one down on the table and cursed. He was starving. A week into academy life, he had encountered an unexpected problem at the cafeteria. He had rushed to the counter, shouting that he was hungry, and ordered a pork belly rice bowl in a hurry. However, the cafeteria lady stared at the meal ticket box next to him. That's when he realized the food wasn't free. Embarrassed, he told her he'd get the ticket right away and asked if she could prepare the meal in advance. But he froze when he saw the price. 50,000 won for a pork belly rice bowl. The other items on the menu ranged from 25,000 won to 150,000 won. He stood in horror, unable to believe the prices. Back in his dorm, he drank the last drop from his water bottle and angrily tossed it aside. He thought 50,000 won for a pork belly rice bowl was outrageous. His living expenses were nearly gone, and he remembered refusing pocket money from his father. Staring at the empty bottles on the floor, he rolled onto his bed, cursing himself for not accepting the money when he had the chance. For days, he had been surviving on the cheapest water from the campus store. Suddenly, a system notification appeared showing that his physical state had increased to 12. As his physical condition improved, the sword specifications relaxed, activating a blessing for swords 32 centimeters, or shorter, and 6 centimeters or less in width. Smiling, he stood up and looked at himself in the mirror, admiring his abs and thinking the effort hadn't been wasted. He wondered if the blessing of the sword god had cleared his blood vessels, feeling as if he were evolving. Despite his progress, he knew the blessing hadn't fully expanded. If he continued improving step by step, he might be able to handle a short sword soon. Staring at the sashimi knives on his counter, he recalled how terrified he had been of holding a blade during the entrance ceremony. Now, if he wasn't holding a knife, his hands itched, making him wonder if this was the blessing's influence. Scratching his head, he asked himself why he felt so proud. Just then, someone knocked on his door. When he opened it, he found Chloe standing there. She asked if she had disturbed his rest, to which he replied no, as he was just lying down. He asked what was going on. She explained that she hadn't seen him in the cafeteria all week and was worried he might not be feeling well. He awkwardly replied that he usually didn't eat food made by others, although in truth he loved food made by others and was starving. She nodded, understanding, and told him not to worry. Then she suggested that if he was up for it, they could buy ingredients from the campus store and make dinner together. Without hesitation, he grabbed his jacket and told her they should go, leaving her confused. He asked if she was inviting him to dinner, and she confirmed, a bit surprised. He happily led the way, telling her that he was good at cooking and would handle it. He asked if her dorm was across the way, to which she replied yes, still chasing after him as he walked with excitement. Later, in Chloe's dorm, she exclaimed how delicious the food was. Jiam smiled and said he was glad she liked it. She complimented him on how quickly and skillfully he had prepared the meal, admitting she had only ever boiled fish and never thought she'd get to taste cooking like that. He quietly stared at the empty plates, pleased. Earlier, he had asked if he could check her fridge, and she had agreed. When he opened it, he noticed it was full of fish. She explained she was from a seaside area, which made sense to him. He smiled, realizing he was itching to cook again. Deciding to treat himself, he thought about slicing some sashimi but hesitated due to the sword god's blessing. Eyeing the kitchen knives on the counter, he asked if she had a longer knife. Chloe was confused, but when he explained that his weapon was similar to those kinds of swords, she understood. She handed him a knife and asked if it would work, but he decided to stick with the kitchen knife. Grabbing the knife, he decided to finish in 30 seconds, activating the blessing of painlessness. He focused on the sashimi, remembering that he had once been the best swordsman in the country. He activated the sword god's blessing and sliced through the fish, finishing in 21 seconds. In that time, he scaled the fish, split the bones, removed the entrails, and filleted the flesh. The result was so perfect, it felt like a masterpiece, and he was proud to still have his skills. Chloe asked how he was so good at cooking, and he replied that he used to work part-time at a Japanese restaurant. She then asked what a part-time job was, surprising him. He asked if she didn't know what it was, and she apologized. He told her there was no need to apologize, attributing the confusion to their difference in status. Changing the subject, he told her he was glad she enjoyed the meal, and she nodded happily, offering to wash up since he had cooked. He thanked her and left her to it. As she rushed to the sink, he walked to the window and stared at the moon, feeling full and satisfied, humming a tune to himself. However, he was interrupted by the sound of plates falling, followed by Chloe's repeated apologies. He wondered if she had ever done the dishes before, thinking back to when he had been her age and doing the same chores. Suddenly, a note fell onto the table, flipping open when it landed. Surprised, he realized it was Chloe's diary. The round handwriting and cute stickers made him think she was just like any other girl her age. He intended to put it back, but the air flipped it open, revealing an entry. He read that the person who saved her during the exam turned out to be in her class, and his name was Jiam. The entry said her heart raced whenever she saw him, and she didn't know how to approach him. He smiled, thinking it was cute, realizing this was why she hadn't been able to talk to him before. Curious, he flipped through a few more pages. His eyes widened in shock when he saw a page written repeatedly, "I love him." At that moment, a loud crash came from the sink. He turned to see Chloe standing there, terrified. She asked him in a trembling voice if he had seen her diary. Heroic families gain honor by slaying monsters, receiving society's admiration, and solidifying their positions. Yet, within these stagnant institutions, vested interests often exploit the weak under the guise of authority. When public authorities fail to condemn such exploitation, one heroic family steps into the shadows, the Auditor de Cecilia family. This family operates covertly, aiming for justice while combining order maintenance with assassination. Those born into the Auditor family undergo mental conditioning before puberty, suppressing their emotions and enduring grueling training to become assassins. Chloe was only 15 when she first killed. She had been startled to see a man tied to a pole, but the old man at her side forced her forward, placing a sword in her hand and making her deliver the fatal blow. Afterward, he reminded her not to deny her talents as an assassin. These were words she had heard repeatedly, even before adulthood. The constant training warped her mind, casting a deep shadow over her heart. By the time her sense of self had been worn away, leaving only fragments of emotion, Chloe was ready to enroll at Jokum Academy. At the academy, where students were assigned to classes based on individual skill, members of the Auditor family, despite their exceptional abilities, were always placed in the common class due to a long-standing tradition and an agreement with the academy. Although the Auditor family operated in the shadows, their skills far surpassed those of the Dragon class. Chloe's grandfather had ordered her to remain unnoticed. The family's strict control took away her personal freedom, forcing her to follow the path of an assassin. She obeyed without a word, believing that nothing would change no matter what she did. At least, that's what she thought until she met Jiam. During the subspace battle royale, Chloe encountered death for the first time, though it wasn't real in that space. Despite the gravity of the situation, she wasn't afraid. Having long accepted her fate, she faced death calmly, no longer struggling against it. But something shifted when she saw Jiam fight. It was as if a storm had parted, letting sunlight break through. For the first time, she felt the desire to wield her sword for someone else, not just out of duty. It was Jiam himself that stirred something warm within her. She recalled a childhood memory, a fairy tale she had secretly kept hidden by her bedside. It was about a prince rescuing a princess from a castle. Her face flushed as she realized the connection, an unfamiliar feeling filling her chest. Love. In the present, Jiam found himself cursing under his breath, watching as Chloe seemed lost in thought. He laughed awkwardly, trying to ease the tension, but her silence and unblinking stare only made him feel more uncomfortable. He realized something had gone wrong, wondering if it had been when he first saw her vulnerability or when he foolishly joined her for dinner. Trying to salvage the situation, Jiam made a polite comment about the evening, hoping to lighten the mood, but she remained fixated on him. He thanked her for the dinner, preparing to leave, but her gaze lingered on him, and she asked, "Did you see it?" Confused, Jiam asked what she meant. Chloe removed her gloves and her attention shifted to the diary on the table. Realization hit him. She was referring to her diary. He attempted to downplay the situation, suggesting that she must have worked hard on her studies, but she corrected him, making it clear she was talking about her personal diary. He felt a surge of unease. How had she known he had seen it? He wondered if she had somehow seen him reading it without him noticing. Then something else struck him. Chloe was using formal language again, despite his earlier insistence that she didn't need to. She suddenly seemed like a completely different person. He quickly denied seeing anything, but Chloe asked him again, "Are you sure?" He repeated his denial, but she pressed him not to lie. Realizing there was no point in denying it further, he admitted that he had seen it for a moment. She simply stared at him, and then, to his shock, she slowly drew her katana from its sheath. Horror surged through him as he glanced down at the edge of the roof. They were on the 4th floor, and if he jumped, he knew he'd be smashed to pieces. Looking around, he realized there was only one exit, the door next to Chloe. He was trapped. A loud scraping sound broke the tension, and when he peeked over his shoulder, his blood ran cold. Chloe was dragging her katana along the floor, walking slowly toward him like a puppet, her movements devoid of emotion. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was she even aware of what she was doing? Her pupils were still, and her red eyes looked lifeless. That's when it hit him. She had all the signs of a yandere. He recalled her energetic personality, so full of life that could change in an instant. Was this a split personality? The realization that she might be a yandere with a split personality was terrifying enough, but the fact that he had triggered this shift by opening her diary made it worse. He knew the situation was dangerous. She would likely chase him until she succeeded in killing him. He had to find a way to escape and ensure his survival. He could sense that Chloe's killing intent was even stronger than the Mao brothers, making him curse under his breath. Academy life was turning out to be far more dangerous than he'd expected. He needed to get out of this situation first. His thoughts raced, and then he remembered that he still had 9 seconds left on his painlessness blessing. However, his sashimi knife was back in his room, and the knife he had used earlier was too far away. If he tried to reach for it, he was certain he'd lose an arm. Or worse. Suddenly, Chloe raised her katana, and in a panic, Jiam stepped back, hitting the table behind him. His eyes fell on a small cutter lying there. She leaped at him, swinging her katana with deadly precision. Desperate, he grabbed the cutter, knowing full well that talking his way out of this was unlikely to work. As he prepared to defend himself, a system notification appeared, showing that his mental state had risen. Along with this, his ingenuity increased, and his words and actions became temporarily imbued with an aura of intimidation. The restraining power adjusted to fit him, and the divine protection of the sword god was activated. As they met in the middle, he tried a different approach, commenting on her hair, saying it was slightly too long and that he would trim it a bit. In that moment, they both released their slashes simultaneously. Later, Chloe woke up in her bed, searching for Jiam and looking around her room. She remembered him standing by the window while she was doing the dishes. She had been sneaking glances at him. Panic set in when she suddenly recalled her katana, but seeing it resting safely next to her study table, she sighed in relief. She had lost consciousness while handling the katana, a side effect of her conditioning. Her thoughts drifted to the old man who had always praised her for her talent as an assassin, telling her not to worry after each kill and reminding her to never deny her abilities. Frustrated, she slammed her face into her pillow, calling herself a fool for fainting. Embarrassed, she thought about Jiam, wondering if she had said anything strange when she lost consciousness. Then her eyes fell on the cutter lying on the floor. Confused, she held her hair up to her face and realized it had been cut shorter. Glancing at the trash bin, she saw the cut strands of hair and guessed that Jiam must have cleaned up before leaving. Blushing, she thought to herself how kind Jiam was and hurried to grab her diary, eager to write down her thoughts before she forgot. As she scribbled her entry, she focused on how much she admired him. Meanwhile, Jiam was outside the dorm, struggling and vomiting by the side of the path. He was relieved to have survived the situation with Chloe, but knew he had pushed his blessing too far, going 5 seconds over the 9-second limit, which left him physically ill. He tried to suppress the nausea, but it was no use. He ended up throwing up everything he had eaten for dinner. Sitting on a nearby bench, he felt the hunger return, his entire meal now gone. As he stared at the moon, Jiam reflected on Chloe and her abilities. Normally, swordsmanship is about striking decisively to end a fight, but the way Chloe fought was different. Her blade relentlessly targeted vital points, almost as if it were designed for ambush tactics. He realized that had she ambushed him, his head would have been taken off without a doubt. Feeling threatened, he had instinctively aimed for her nape during their encounter. Thankfully, the cutter he wielded was short, so he only managed to cut her hair. He sighed, relieved that he had cleaned up the situation quickly and that there shouldn't be any further complications. Though he admitted to himself that finding stability, safety, and security in this world was proving far more difficult than he anticipated. He reflected on how much harder it was to simply lead an ordinary life. When he was first thrown into this strange, shameless, game-like world, he hadn't lacked ambition. For someone who had once reigned at the pinnacle with nothing more than a sashimi knife, giving up on the romantic idea of living as a man had been a tough choice. But he knew that everyone had their assigned role. He then thought about the game he was now living in. The blessing of miracles was the unique blessing of the game's protagonist, whom Jiam had yet to encounter. Alongside it was the blessing of valor from Baylor Hoken. He remembered that these were the only 2 legendary blessings in the game, and their contents were intuitive. The protagonist wielded both the holy sword and the demon sword, Bamong. In contrast, Jiam could only use sashimi knives, a fact that made him wonder if any further explanation of his fate was even necessary. Slapping his face to refocus, Jiam reminded himself of his goal since entering the academy. The constant encounters with unrealistic characters and bizarre situations had distracted him from what he came to achieve. He realized that he had been sidetracked by various events and began to wonder if there was anyone ordinary in this world at all. Despite having a vague understanding of the key characters in the game, Jiam still felt his knowledge of this world was lacking. After all, it had only been a little over a week since he entered the academy. According to the game's story, the main character's blessing was due to activate soon, with the enrollment process almost complete. Jiam knew the real story was finally about to begin. Jiam knew the general plot of the game, but having never seen the ending gave him an advantage, at least up to the midpoint. He decided that no matter what happened, he should stick to the official route. If things strayed too far off course, it would waste whatever benefits he might gain from his knowledge. He recalled that the story took a much darker turn in the 2nd semester of the 3rd year, when the birth of a hero would cause the demon race to unite under their demon lords and threaten the academy. This would lead to a full-scale war between demons and humanity. He remembered the game's typical cliché fantasy plot. As someone who had once sought a charming, youthful life he never got to experience, he had deleted the game halfway through, Now, though, the realization that this terrible war was real chilled him, making him wonder if he too was doomed to die in it. But he shook off those thoughts, deciding that with nearly 3 years left, he needed a more realistic goal than mere escapism. He couldn't allow himself to die quietly in this world. He needed to get stronger and survive. Most mass-produced games like this one tended to have happy endings, and he guessed that the protagonist would save the world. But he couldn't rely on that alone. He needed power to protect himself. He couldn't live with the constant fear of dying in a war, caught up in events beyond his control. That meant training, but he would have to do it without drawing too much attention. If he stood out, he risked being conscripted to fight against the demon army, something he needed to avoid at all costs. He also reminded himself to be cautious with the blessing of painlessness. Though he picked up the sashimi knife out of necessity, the strain on his body from using the blessing was too great. A system notification appeared, showing his blessing stats. Though the performance looked impressive, there was a lot of new information he wasn't sure how to interpret. He focused on the stats, noting that his physical, mental, and weapon ranks seemed to represent his levels of growth. His eyes landed on the assimilation rate, but when he tried to check what it meant, the system blocked his access, telling him that conditions had not yet been met. It didn't seem important for now. What mattered most was his physical training, and he needed a new weapon. Relying solely on the blessing of painlessness for 30 seconds wouldn't work forever. He also needed to train with swords that didn't meet the conditions for the sword god's blessing. Next month's practical combat training would replace the midterm exams, and the reward for excelling was the Muramasa, a B-ranked sword. Guillaume knew that if he could handle it skillfully, it would be enough to carry him through graduation. Its specification didn't meet the activation conditions for the sword god's blessing, so it wouldn't put as much strain on him as his primary weapon. Realizing he had more to do than he thought, Guillaume was suddenly interrupted by someone calling his name. When he turned, he saw Abel standing nearby, telling him that he was sitting in her spot. He froze in shock, staring at her speechless. Sweat ran down his face as he struggled to respond, and for a moment he couldn't move. Abel asked if he could shift over a bit, snapping him out of his daze. Embarrassed, he moved aside, wondering why he had been staring so blankly at her. Abel told him there was no need to leave the bench completely, just to make a little space. He obliged, still at a loss for words. He silently wondered what she meant by her spot. Weren't benches public property? Was this something related to the Academy's class system? He knew getting involved with Abel, the heroine, would only complicate the main story, so he resolved to avoid her, even though it was awkward. But when he saw her lips, he cursed silently. She really was beautiful. He was startled when Abel mentioned that the spot offered the best view of the stars. He didn't respond immediately, still staring at her and trying to reconcile her appearance with the Abel he knew from the game. The memory of Abel being the Sword Saint's granddaughter and the protagonist's difficult-to-approach love interest made him uneasy. Abel then asked if his weapon was also a sword, surprising him. When he asked how she knew, she explained that her grandfather had told her. She added that sword masters had a certain look in their eyes, and as she stared at him, Guillaume felt his face grow hot. She then handed him her sword, offering him the chance to hold it. He took it, commenting that it didn't feel particularly heavy. Abel sulked in response, turning away, leaving Guillaume to wonder if she was really upset. Abel was harder to get used to than he'd anticipated. Was this truly the same Abel he remembered from the game? Abel turned her gaze back to him, asking if he knew who she was. Guillaume wondered if Abel was being suspicious of him, even though there wasn't a single student at the academy who wouldn't know who she was. He responded vaguely, saying he knew her roughly. Abel, however, pointed out that she didn't know him at all, which left him unsure of what she wanted. She remarked that it seemed unfair for him to know her name when she had no idea who he was. When he hesitated, Abel teasingly suggested that he might be a demon lord spy disguised as a student sneaking into the academy. After all, she continued, there didn't seem to be any other reason for him to be sitting there alone at that hour. Her words left him wondering what she truly meant, But before he could ask, she raised her sword at him, leaving him in disbelief. He tried turning the question back on her, asking what she was doing, but Abel simply replied that she had been exercising and training. Pointing at him, she asked what kind of exercise he had been doing. Flustered, he said he was practicing breathing, which left her momentarily stunned and confused. As the conversation shifted, Jiam noticed wounds on her hands. When Abel realized he was staring, she quickly hid them behind her back, growing shy and falling silent for a moment. Guillaume broke the silence, telling her that she was quite dedicated to her training, to which she agreed. She confessed that few people understood the pressure of inheriting the blood of Niam. She felt the need to always be perfect because, in her world, even the slightest flaw could lead to harsh criticism. Abel asked if he knew she wasn't the top student that year. She admitted that losing to someone for the first time in her life had been a humbling experience. However, she found it refreshing in a way. Still, she was curious about who had beaten her, vowing to take them down the next time they met. Her bold statement stunned Jiam, causing him to cough in shock. He awkwardly suggested that it wasn't necessary to take them down, but Abel quickly dismissed his words, saying it was a matter of pride. She had even begged her grandfather to tell her who the top student was, but found out that they weren't even in her class and had skipped the top student's swearing-in ceremony. Abel expressed disbelief that a second-place student like herself could tolerate such a thing. Snapping out of her train of thought, Abel suddenly realized she had been sharing all of this with someone she had just met. Jiam asked why she was telling him all of this, to which she replied that he seemed weak. She went on to explain that her family motto was to be strict with the strong and merciful to the weak, leaving Jiam staring at her in disbelief. Abel added that the students in her class were so bland that she didn't really have any friends, making Jiam realize why she had seemed so cold toward the protagonist in the game. Stretching her body, Abel stood up, saying she should head inside and bid him goodbye. Just before walking away, she turned and shouted, asking when he would tell her his name. He responded that he didn't want to, causing her to shout at him in frustration as she left. The next day, Guillaume sat in class, reflecting on how his academy life had been flowing by smoothly and steadily. He kept a low profile, especially around Chloe, who had blended in well and even made friends. On the other hand, he avoided eye contact with her out of fear, still shaken by their last encounter. Occasionally, when their eyes did meet, Chloe's new friends would glare at him coldly. However, the disdainful looks didn't bother him much anymore. After all, he wasn't the only exceptional student in the Tiger class. There were simply too few of them, and for some reason, there was a general reluctance among the exceptional students to stand out. Guillaume guessed this reluctance stemmed from a kind of inferiority complex. Reflecting on his decision, he felt relieved that he hadn't chosen a higher class. This was the time when students in the Star and Dragon classes began forming factions and engaging in heavy political maneuvering, something that even made Jiam's head spin when he thought about it. Back when he played the game, the intrigue had been enough to make anyone's tongue wag, and as a commoner, the idea of being assigned to those upper classes was chilling. Looking at the black card in his hand, Jiam smiled, feeling glad that he was finally eating well again. He thought about what he should have for today's meal, remembering how Medea had given him the card, explaining that it was supposed to be his reward for being the top student. She had apologized for the delay, and now Jiam couldn't help but feel thankful. As he stared happily at the black card, he thought that the level of favor he had received was so great it almost warranted bowing in front of the headmaster's office 3 times a day. For the first time, he sincerely thanked Medea in his heart. Jiam questioned whether he was faithfully fulfilling his duties as a student. Reflecting on his actions so far, he felt confident that he hadn't done anything to disrupt the main scenario, which gave him a sense of accomplishment. With that in mind, he decided that if he could continue like this for the next 3 years, he might just reach the future he envisioned for himself. Later, during class, their instructor taught them about the history of the First Demon War, which had broken out 700 years ago. The hero Valor Hoken, foreseeing the need to cultivate the next generation of heroes, established the academy with his 7 disciples. The instructor emphasized that this part would be on the exam, but Guillaume felt sleepy. He vaguely remembered the details, recalling that Valor Hoken had fought against Lion, the right-hand man of the Demon Lord and commander of the First Legion. After 20 years of bloody conflict, Valor Hoken emerged victorious, but at great personal cost. He lost an arm and could no longer fight. The war had been brutal, with no clear victor on either side. Fortunately, a ceasefire was reached, and Hoken established the academy to train future generations of heroes. The instructor went on to explain that the First Demon War had resulted in a non-aggression pact between humans and demons, leading to 700 years of peace. One student asked if they would see another war in their lifetime, but his friend jokingly replied that he was more worried about what to wear to tomorrow's party. Jiam, however, knew that the end of this long peace was fast approaching, though no one else seemed to realize it. Everyone had become so accustomed to peace that it felt natural, but Jiam knew better. He considered giving Medea a hint, but he feared it could lead to unforeseen consequences. Medea often spoke about wanting to step down as academy director, but Jiam knew she was crucial to the upcoming events. Her unique divine protection, the poet's blessing, made her the first to detect the impending threat, and she would be the first among the 7-star heroes to rush to the front lines to protect the students. Although Jiam hadn't played that far in the game, he remembered reading on Kumi that Medea would be the first of the 7-star heroes to be sacrificed by the Demon Lord's army. Back then, seeing it online hadn't affected him much. He had simply thought of it as another game event. But now, with everything feeling so real, the thought of Medea's fate weighed heavily on him. He wished, in some way, that she hadn't been so perceptive. The instructor announced the end of class, reminding everyone to study hard for the midterms in 2 weeks. As students began leaving the room, a commotion stirred outside. Other students asked what was happening, and Jiam, curious, wondered what all the noise was about. Suddenly, someone shouted in excitement, asking if it was them. Alarmed, Jiam quickly checked the date, his heart sinking as he realized what was happening. It was May 15th. He rushed out of the room as a crowd began gathering, his mind racing. If his memory served him correctly, today was the day. It was the enrollment date of the world's protagonist, Leon van Reinhardt, the day when the cracks in the long 700 years of peace would begin to show. Kang Gyam finds Leon annoying, particularly because the women who will fall for him include Rachel Dura, niece of the Spear Saint, Saki Ryoho, daughter of the Bow Saint, and Abel von Nebelong, granddaughter of the Sword Emperor. Kang Gyam thinks that even the members of the protagonist's party are impressive. The protagonist of The Blessing of Miracles, Leon van Reinhardt, will be one of the first drafted in 3 years. In reality, drafted is a nice way of putting it, as it is no different from forced conscription, and Kang Gyam refuses to go through that a second time. By the way, even Valor Hoken was only able to seal the First Legion commander, which makes Kang Gyam wonder just how powerful the Demon King truly is. Kang Gyam knows that this isn't some insane story where the protagonist loses. Just then, Leon looks at Kang Gyam and smiles, which surprises him. Kang Gyam reflects that Leon has the blessing of miracles, suggesting that the protagonist of the story will be able to handle things on his own. Kang Gyam notices that Leon has a pretty trustworthy face and finds himself convinced, without realizing it. The scene then shifts to the training hall, where Kang Gyam is practicing with a wooden sword. After a few swings, Kang Gyam realizes that deviating from the standard means the blessing doesn't manifest. He needs to possess a certain level of skill and swordsmanship. Just then, Chloe approaches Kang Gyam and asks if she made some kind of mistake. Surprised, Kang Gyam wonders when she arrived. He tells Chloe that nothing happened, to which she asks, "Really?" Kang Gyam reassures her, as he intends to keep things peaceful and doesn't want to make unnecessary enemies. Chloe expresses her relief, saying that's a good thing. In his mind, Kang Gyam contemplates Chloe's true identity. She'd been able to handle a sword even while unconscious, a sword filled with sorrow. The blade seemed to plead for help for some reason, yet it was still imbued with killing intent, making Chloe more dangerous than the Ma brothers. Chloe then asks Kang Gyam if it's okay with him for her to invite him to dinner that night, as she really wants to repay him. Of course, Chloe isn't as skilled in cooking as Kang Gyam. As he thinks about dinner, Kang Gyam recalls what happened last time. However, seeing the look on Chloe's face, he hesitates. Kang Gyam thinks it feels awkward to refuse, but if he accepts, he might find himself in trouble. Then he comes up with an idea and asks Chloe if it's a bit awkward to say, but instead of dinner, could he ask her for a favor? He explains that he couldn't think of anyone else but Chloe to rely on. Hearing this, Chloe becomes happy and asks what the favor is. Kang Gyam states that he would like Chloe to teach him swordsmanship. Then the scene shifts to a few moments later, where Kang Gyam, while holding the wooden sword, thinks that he needs a swordsmanship teacher anyway, and Chloe is frighteningly strong. Kang Gyam wonders if this is a good excuse, considering that since that day, the one thing he makes sure to watch before going to bed is how to survive a yandere, which has proven helpful. Chloe, radiating her bright energy, approaches Kang Gyam and asks when he arrived, mentioning that she was waiting for him over there. Kang Gyam replies that he just got here and then asks Chloe what about her. She responds that she also just arrived. Kang Gyam inquires about the time, and Chloe tells him it was around 6:30. He reminds her that they agreed to meet at 8, and Chloe can't help but smile. Kang Gyam keeps staring at Chloe and looking at her outfit. Seeing this, Chloe asks Kang Gyam if something is wrong. He replies that it's nothing. In his mind, Kang Gyam reflects that he hadn't noticed when Chloe was in her uniform, but now he can see her toned abs and muscles. He understands why Chloe is so strong and finds her cute as well. Kang Gyam hands Chloe the wooden sword, and as she takes it, she remarks that she thought they would be using real swords. Surprised by this, Kang Gyam wonders if he heard her correctly. Who trains with real swords? This is not a battle. He tells Chloe that it's training, so they should use wooden swords to avoid injuries. Chloe states that Kang Gyam is really kind. As Chloe swings the wooden sword, Kang Gyam is stunned to see her aura power manifesting even through the wooden weapon. He wonders just how strong Chloe's aura is. As Kang Gyam grabs his wooden sword, he decides to be careful. Suddenly, a status window opens up and Kang Gyam confirms whether he can use the wooden sword without activating the blessing. He sees that the sword specifications are fine and that his physical growth is steady, but he wonders if the blessing is usually like this. While it's common for a blessing to upgrade with skill level, Kang Gyam wonders if it usually comes with additional effects, as he doesn't recall it being like this. He considers how much growth is needed to see this. Observing Kang Gyam standing there, Chloe asks if something is wrong. Kang Gyam apologizes to her, stating that it's nothing. In his mind, he thinks that this status window seems to be visible only to him, which means he must look like a spaced-out idiot to Chloe. Seeing Chloe's excitement, Kang Gyam reminds her that today is his first time doing swordsmanship, so she should go easy on him. Chloe replies, "Of course." Kang Gyam gets ready and states that they should begin. As they face each other, he reflects on his practical approach in his past life. As the saying goes, seeing is believing. To become a master in any field, it's not enough to merely work hard. Kang Gyam's quick adaptation to the academy is also a product of the learning he has absorbed since he was young. Chloe gets ready to strike as she begins to gather her aura. Kang Gyam thinks to himself that his hands are sweaty and his posture is awkward because the essence of swordsmanship is to precisely strike the opponent. Chloe charges straight at Kang Gyam with full speed. Surprised by her speed, Kang Gyam barely manages to avoid her strike. Stunned, he thinks that he told Chloe to take it easy, but she seems to be in a league of her own. She strikes at him again, and Kang Gyam blocks it with his sword, finding her strike incredibly heavy. After barely managing to block her attack once more, Kang Gyam decides to counterattack. To his surprise, Chloe jumps into the air and prepares to strike at him again. Trying to focus, Kang Gyam notices that Chloe is moving even faster than before as she strikes. Kang Gyam braces himself and takes the hit head-on with his sword, but Chloe's attacks don't stop there. She continues to strike at him from different angles again and again. Kang Gyam finds himself being pushed back, realizing that her strikes are extraordinarily heavy. If he takes many more hits like this, he might be seriously injured. As Kang Gyam reaches his limits, he struggles to find an opportunity to counterattack. But then suddenly, Kang Gyam's wooden sword breaks in half. Seeing this, Chloe apologizes to him, explaining that she meant to go easy but ended up breaking the wooden sword. However, at that moment, it becomes clear that Kongyam's broken wooden sword has now met the conditions for the blessing of the sword god, and the blessing is activated. Kongyam loses control and finds himself surrounded by a blue aura. Surprised, Chloe backs off, unable to understand what is happening. She asks Kongyam if he is all right, but he doesn't listen and charges at her with full force. Stunned, Chloe barely manages to block the strike, but Kongyam is now more powerful than before and pushes her back, causing her to crash into the wall. Stunned, Chloe thinks that Kongyam seems like a completely different person from just moments ago. Kongyam, on the other hand, wastes no time and strikes at Chloe again, but she dodges the attack. He has completely lost control and is now under the influence of the blessing of the sword god. Seemingly injured, Chloe reflects that Kongyam's previous attack caught her off guard, making it hard for her to move. Now she wonders what on earth has happened to him. Although Chloe doesn't understand what is going on, she realizes she needs to stop the match for now. She tells Kongyam to stop, but he charges at her with incredible speed. Seeing Kongyam approach, Chloe thinks that she can't avoid this strike. She tells Kongyam to get a hold of himself, but just as he is about to strike at Chloe, she shouts his name. The scene shifts to Kongyam, who seems to be somewhere in the kitchen, where he hears Chloe's voice calling for him. We then return to the training ground where Kongyam has thrown his sword into the wall, missing Chloe. Chloe tells Kongyam that it's her, and he smiles at her, apologizing and stating that they should stop for today. Seeing that Kongyam is back to normal, Chloe asks if he is all right. Kongyam thanks Chloe for helping him with his practice and mentions that he will head in first. As Kongyam leaves the training ground, the scene shifts to later that night, where Chloe is walking to her dorm. She reflects that ever since the class assignment test, Kongyam's skills are not just raw strength, but carry an eerie feeling. It's not only his skill, but also his raw instinct. Even though the blessing manifested unconsciously, Chloe realizes she is still no match for Kongyam, especially with a half-training sword. She knew he was strong, but never expected him to be this powerful. At that moment, someone with a mask covering his face tells Chloe that she seems to be enjoying herself. Chloe's expression turns serious upon seeing the masked man. The masked man's name is Knox Ader, a second-year student. Chloe addresses Knox as brother and asks him what he is doing here. Knox responds by questioning if this is all Chloe is doing after entering the academy, making friends with commoners. Chloe insists that Knox should not refer to Kongyam in that manner. Hearing this, Knox acknowledges that the guy's name is Kongyam and warns Chloe that if she continues to associate with him, the auditor family will eliminate him. Chloe walks past Knox, telling him that even if the entire auditor family comes, they will not be able to handle Kongyam. Knox, taken aback, wonders who this Kongyam is. The scene then shifts to Kongyam, who reflects that he needs to clarify something. The power he has been granted is not a fine blessing or favor. Rather, it seems more like a curse. To avoid relying on the blessing of the sword god, Kongyam sets out to find new equipment, but that power seems to mock his efforts, following him and taking control of his body. While Kongyam feels no pain, he also experiences a debilitating sensation that seems to go on endlessly. That curse manipulates Kongyam like a marionette bound by threads. Kongyam surrenders completely to the voice that whispers sweet words to him. Cut more, destroy more. Chloe's scream, filled with desperation, calls out the name that Kongyam has come to recognize as his own. Kongyam Jama. In that cry, the fragments of the worlds are brought together. Kongyam throws away the training sword that had clung to him like his own skin, realizing that if he does not detach it now, he will lose himself forever. Until recently, Chloe was merely a yandere who wanted to kill Kongyam, but now she has become the girl who revived his fading consciousness. Although Chloe was the one who originally broke the sword and caused this issue, Kongyam feels a mix of irritation and gratitude. Therefore, he decides to let it go without dwelling on it further. Even so, Kongyam leaves in a hurry to avoid the possibility of the sword god's blessing manifesting again. But could he truly evade this problem for the rest of his life? The sword god's blessing was a talent that felt close to a curse, manifested by trading one's lifespan. It was a burden that Kong had to bear as an outsider cast into this world. Kong didn't wish for much. He simply wanted to live a normal life. He believed he could handle a few incidents as they arose, but only now did he realize there was something within his body, something trying to consume his reason. This was not a blessing. Rather, it was a curse solely intended to devour Kongyam, the art of the reverse heavens. After 3 days in the classroom, a girl cheerfully tells Chloe, "Yesterday was a crazy day. You should have seen it." She smiles playfully. Chloe responds with a soft smile. "Yeah, I'll watch it later." But in her thoughts, she reflects, "Since that day, I haven't seen Kongyam." Her eyes shift toward his empty seat, a sense of unease creeping into her heart. She realizes that she doesn't even have Kongyam's contact number. Why didn't I ask him for it? She regrets. I even knocked on his door, but all I heard were groans of pain. I wanted to break in, but I was afraid he'd hate me. So I just turned away. Still gazing at Kong's empty seat, Chloe whispers to herself, "I like watching him when he's deep in thought," resting his chin on his hand. "I've lost count of how many times I've glanced at him every morning." She sighs. "I'm afraid he'll think I'm weird, so I'm always careful when I talk to him. At first, I thought I liked him because he saved my life. But maybe that was just an excuse." She sighs again, this time quietly. "I miss him." The next day, the scene shifts to the academy, where the instructor shouts at the class, "Calm down, everyone. Quit it now. Are the students at this prestigious school just full of empty talk?" Silence. The room falls into silence. The instructor clears his throat and announces, "Since the weather forecast predicts rain today, training will be replaced with self-study." In the quiet, the instructor muses to himself, "Once again, Kong didn't show up today. He must have his reasons." Trusting and waiting is the true duty of an educator. Suddenly, he barks, "Who dares to come and go during class hours?" His eyes widen in surprise. "Huh?" The entire class looks toward the door. Kong steps into the classroom, his face serious, a stark contrast to the lively chatter of moments ago. Chloe is equally shocked to see him. Kong without hesitation, approaches the instructor and says, "I'm sorry for being late." The instructor, startled by his sudden reappearance, waves it off. "Oh, it's fine. Just sit down." As Kong takes his seat, murmurs ripple through the classroom. One of the girls whispers, "Isn't he a special student?" Another girl replies, "Has he always looked like that?" A third one chimes in, "He looks a bit more handsome today, doesn't he?" During the break, with some students starving and ready to eat, Chloe gathers her courage and approaches Kong. Nervously, she says, "Hello, Kong." He replies formally, "Yes, Chloe?" Hesitant but concerned, she asks, "Did something happen to you?" Kong briefly glances at her. "No, nothing happened." His lack of eye contact unsettles her, and she stammers, "It's just, you've been absent for a few days, so I thought something was wrong." After a pause, she adds, "Is this because of the battle training?" Kong, now looking more solemn, responds, "I had a severe fever these past few days. Thank you for worrying about me." Chloe is taken aback. You were sick?" Kong nods, his voice steady but distant. "Yes, it's natural to be suspicious. These past few days, I've been tormented to the point where my mental state collapsed, as if going through severe withdrawal. I couldn't eat anything, so I locked myself in my room and buried myself in bed, praying for the pain to stop. It's the price of using a damaged weapon. The pain was worse than anything I've ever felt." Chloe gasps, shocked at his revelation. He continues, "But that's not the only strange thing. When I looked in the mirror, my face, it's the same bone structure, but my expression has become colder. And some parts of my hair have turned white. It's obvious this is the penalty of that damn divine power." Kong clenches his fists, frustration seeping through. "It seems like she feels guilty," he muses, looking at Chloe's worried face. "Well, that's understandable. The last person I fought and met was her." Determined to clear the air, he says, Chloe, how about we have dinner together, like I promised? Tonight? Her eyes widen in surprise. Dinner? You mean it? Kang Gyam nods. Yes, but this time I want to eat your cooking. In an instant, Chloe's face lights up, and she nearly jumps in the air with excitement. Yes, of course. I'll do my best. I can't wait. Beaming, she asks, So Kang, I'll cook whatever you want. What do you like to eat? He thinks for a moment and replies, I haven't had fish in a while. The last time I had it, I couldn't eat it, because the fish was too expensive. So I've never really had it. Suddenly, a red thread darts across Kang's neck. He and Chloe look toward the door and see a masked man standing there. Chloe's expression shifts from excitement to terror. Kang Gyum senses the change and asks her, Do you know him? Without breaking her gaze, Chloe steps forward, whispering, Nox. Brother, I told you not to come. Kang Gyum watches as Nox, her brother, stands silently at the door. He can feel the tension in Chloe's trembling voice. She must be scared, he realizes. Nox finally speaks, his voice calm, but with an edge of menace. Are you sure you want to be with someone like him, even at the cost of breaking the auditor family's rules? Chloe steps closer, her defiance evident. Whatever it is, Nox, it's no longer my concern. Nox raises an eyebrow. Once you stain your hands with blood, you can never wash it off. Once you are born into the auditor family, you are bound forever. Kang Jiam, observing this, thinks, her brother talks like someone from a historical drama. Then, understanding the gravity of the situation, he thinks, the auditor family. They're assassins. People say they are unmatched in stealth and infiltration. His thoughts race. So, this is Chloe's background? A family of killers. No wonder she's so strong. But maybe, like me, she just wants a normal life. Determined to act, Kang Gyam pushes Chloe behind him and says, I'll talk to him. Facing Nox, Kang Gyam speaks firmly. What was that name you just said? Nox narrows his eyes. In that moment, Kang Gyam thinks, I've tried to escape the sword god's blessing, but I can't run from it anymore. If I can't escape, I might as well push forward. Taking a step toward Nox, he introduces himself. My name is Kang Gyam. Kang means sword, and Gyam means demon. He gestures for Chloe to follow him. I will cut down everyone. I am a swordsman. Meanwhile, in the faculty office, the instructor, seated at his desk, reflects on Kang Gyam. There's something strange about him. The instructor muses. It's like all his emotions have been stripped away. Suddenly, a girl bursts into the office, looking amused. What's going on? Why does your head look emptier today? The instructor groans. Don't mock a bald person. Laughing, she says, Sorry. At that moment, the instructor receives a phone call. This is Lee Wanbin, head instructor of the Wolf class. On the other end of the line, he hears something that shocks him. What? A subspace? So sudden? Who's the student requesting it and who's the opponent? The response causes him to stiffen. The student is Kang Gyam and the opponent is Nox Auditor. The system displayed on a computer screen where a timer is running, and the names of both competitors, Nox Auditor and Kang Gyam, are written on the screen. In the next scene, we see that Kang Gyam is waiting, and there are 15 minutes left for the fight to start. He thinks to himself, I thought this process would be very complicated, but everything seems to be going smoothly. Just then, Sage Media arrives and asks Kang Gyam, Are you really serious about this? Do you really want to go through with it? Take care of yourself. Kang Gyam thinks that all this subspace stuff doesn't really affect real life. But even though the wounds from here don't appear in real life, the mental scars remain. He then thinks, whatever happens, I have to win. That's the only thing that matters. Sitting in the waiting room, he hears the noise from outside. He thinks, everyone loves to watch fights. They're exciting, but I didn't expect this to be so thrilling. I didn't think I could ever feel this way. But now I think this is all pointless. Chloe looks at Kang Gyam with tears in her eyes and says, Don't go. Kang Jeom responds, don't blame yourself. This isn't your fault. Don't worry. He then says passionately, you gave me your weapon. I will fight and win. Everything will be fine. Chloe thinks, my brother is very strong. Kang Yeom says, you are very strong. Chloe replies, my brother is a genius and talented. In our family, the auditor family, when it comes to weapons, no one is better than him. He was already given the title of the Great Master of Knight Techniques at the age of 14. Kang Yeom thinks, who came up with the title the Greatest Master of Knight Techniques? Ah yes, now I remember. It has always been like this. Looking at the knife, he thinks, no matter what I do, I can't escape from this. I have no choice but to make this decision. Kang Yeom remembers his master and thinks, I was destined to hold and use a knife in my life. No one would have thought that in my second life, I would be using the knife like this. Just then, an announcement is made. We will begin the subspace pairing. Selected students, please enter the training arena. Kang Yeom says, I'm going now. Chloe says, okay, take care of yourself. She is worried about him. Kang Yeom says, Chloe. And she replies, yes? Kang Yeom says, there are many geniuses in this world, but in the end, I'm the one who will win this battle. Kang Yeom says goodbye and heads toward the arena. As Kang Yeom enters the arena, he is overwhelmed by the loud roars coming from all around him. The crowd is buzzing with excitement. One man yells out, I believe in the new special student? Damn it, give it everything you've got. I've been waiting for a fight like this for a long time. Kang Yeom smirks, thinking, this is giving me the feeling of being a Roman gladiator. I never thought there would be such a crowd. As his gaze scans the crowd, something catches his attention. What is this? He mutters. There's a star class here too? He notices Abel Vaughn and a few other girls sitting with Leon Van, watching the fight. Kang Yeom frowns. Don't they have anything better to do? Their presence here is just adding unnecessary pressure. Suddenly, Knox arrives and with a sneer says, Commoner, are you kidding me right now? Seems like you can't tell the difference between bravery and arrogance. How dare you challenge me with such a pitiful weapon? At that moment, Kang Yeom feels the intense killing intent radiating from Knox. He thinks, this bastard is insane. Without flinching, Kang Yeom responds, a real monster doesn't care about the weapon. Knox smirks, his eyes narrowing. First, I'll shut that arrogant mouth of yours. He unsheathes his sword, adding with malice, I'll cut your tongue in half. Kang Yeom, in a mocking tone, replies, oh man, you're relying on your weapon, aren't you? He notices Knox has two blades known as the Hangrian blades, hidden blessings from the top-tier blessings of this world, specifically the blessing of the crow. Kang Yeom feels a shift in Knox's intent and thinks, now I can feel it. He truly wants to kill me. Chuckling to himself, Kang Yeom reflects, an S-rank weapon, huh? How ridiculous. But now I'm dead serious. In Kang Yeom's hands, he holds two knives, the Single Sashimi and the rose knife. Crafted by Chloe herself, its rank still unknown. As they prepare to strike, an announcement is made. We will now open the subspace veil. Both fighters charge at each other when suddenly a window pops up, displaying the Painless Blessing Manifest. The Sword God Blessing Manifest. Meanwhile, in the crowd, a few onlookers murmur, did you see that? One of them responds, I couldn't see anything. That's not a weak class, not at that speed. The fight intensifies as they clash. The girls from the hero class whisper in awe, this fight, it's too fast. It's getting interesting. Abel Vaughn watches in disbelief. That seemingly weak boy, can he really fight this well? The battle escalates, with Knox striking furiously at Kang Yeom, but every attack is swiftly countered. Their movements are so fast that cracks begin to appear in the fabric of the subspace around them. Knox growls, this bastard. Let's see how you handle my technique. He unleashes the three-legged crow technique, attacking Kang Yeom from all sides. Now you're finished, he thinks, believing he has Kang Guillaume cornered. But in a flash, Kang Guillaume disappears. Frustrated, Nox yells, "How did he escape? How did he do that?" In the crowd, a boy remarks, "I could catch glimpses, but that second-year student is clearly superior, right? The first year is too busy dodging, while the second year is amazing. You can't understand a year of battle experience." But Abel Vaughn shakes her head, thinking, no one is paying close enough attention. It's true the second year is attacking seriously, but the first year, he's easily dodging every move. He's refusing to fight back. Gritting his teeth in anger, Knox mutters, "My sister was right. This guy is no ordinary person. Even with the blessing of the crow technique, I couldn't land a hit." He realizes, he dodged every one of my attacks so effortlessly. I focused too much on speed. I have to be cautious of his ability. Determined, Knox thinks. I'll end this with a wide-range attack. A single blow to finish him off. Looking at Kang Guillaume, Knox seethes with rage. The more I look at him, the angrier I get. He's doing all this with nothing but a kitchen knife. Suddenly, Kang Guillaume throws one of his knives to the ground. Knox, shocked, exclaims, "You threw away your weapon in the middle of a fight? What's your plan?" Without hesitation, Kang Guillaume grabs the remaining knife in both hands, pointing it at Knox. Furious, Knox roars, "You damn bastard. Are you mocking me with this ridiculous stance? A lowborn with no family lineage dares to challenge me?" He summons all his strength and power, declaring, "I'll finish you off in one blow. Nothing can stand against my sword." As they charge at each other, I just wanted to live a peaceful life without drawing attention. I wanted to follow the rules, but this was a burden I couldn't escape. This feeling, it's been following me, controlling me. There's something inside me that's trying to devour me. Have I sold my soul to this power? As he fights, a sharp pain erupts in his shoulder. He looks down, realizing that his entire arm has been cut off. The crowd gasps in horror. How did that happen? Kang Guillaume grits his teeth, thinking, whether it's a blessing or a curse, I will use it. Goodbye to my peaceful future. Meanwhile, Knox stares at his own severed hand on the ground, bewildered by how the tables have turned. And with that, the chapter ends. Hope you guys like my efforts and subscribe my channel for updates.
Our story picks up right where it left off, with Knox Auditor staring in absolute shock, his face drained of color, anger burning in his eyes as he watches his severed hand lying limp on the ground, blood pooling around it. What is this nonsense? He thinks, his mind reeling from disbelief, his gaze locked on Kang Guillaume, who stands unfazed, as if the brutal clash hadn't even fazed him. Just then, a system window materializes in the air, announcing in a robotic tone, "Subspace barrier has been turned off." Slowly, the shimmering barrier surrounding the arena begins to dissipate, leaving the spectators, students from the academy, utterly stunned, their mouths agape in shock. They can't believe what they just witnessed. Knox is now on his hands and knees, defeated, his once intimidating aura shattered. Meanwhile, Kang Guillaume remains calm, as if the fight had been nothing more than an inconvenience, carefully sheathing his sashimi knife with a steady hand. In the audience, Abelvan and Rachel exchange looks of disbelief, their eyes wide with awe. They, like everyone else, are struggling to comprehend how a first-year student could have triumphed over the seemingly unbeatable Knox Auditor. Standing tall and firm, Kang Guillaume adopts a victorious stance, radiating a quiet but undeniable confidence. His mind, however, is elsewhere. I didn't expect everyone to react like this, he thinks, surveying the stunned faces around him. But now, there's no turning back. He lets out a quiet breath, glancing down at the sashimi knife that had won him the fight. The blade gleams faintly in the dim light of the arena. I did all of this with a knife meant for cutting fish. As satisfying as it is, using it to cut down a person feels both unpleasant and ridiculous. This isn't what it was made for. As strange as the sensation of victory feels, he finds some small solace in knowing that the fight happened within the confines of the subspace. At least the Mayo brothers and Knox were both in the subspace, he thinks, where the consequences are somewhat limited. The specs of the subspace really are impressive. Still, Knox, kneeling on the ground, remains in disbelief, his mind racing to process the loss. His thoughts echo with Chloe's warning. This guy is strong. He never truly believed her. How could a freshman be so powerful? But now, faced with defeat, Knox realizes that Kang Guillaume's strength was not just physical, it was the sheer, lethal determination in his eyes that set him apart. That's what allowed him to defeat me. An announcement booms across the arena, cutting through the tense silence. The winner is the freshman from the Tiger class. A large screen lights up, displaying Kang Guillaume's name, and the unbelievable record of the fight flashes below it. 26 seconds. The crowd erupts into murmurs of disbelief. Some cheer in excitement, while others whisper in shock. How could a first-year student, a special admission no less, defeat Knox auditor so easily? Kang Guillaume watches the crowd, a small smirk tugging at his lips. Damn, he thinks, the company should really teach people how to be less shameless with their publicity. He lets the thought roll off his shoulders. But whatever. What's done is done. This is the path I chose, and there's no turning back now. As he mentally steels himself, he resolves, I'll endure this with sheer will and grit, no matter what comes next. Meanwhile, in the stands, the students are abuzz with speculation. Some are still trying to wrap their minds around the fight. How did he do it? Knox is from the auditor family, someone exclaims. Are you talking about yesterday's fight? Another student adds. Kang Guillaume must be incredibly strong. There's no other explanation. But amidst the chatter, the true focus is on Abel Vaughn. Sitting at her bench, her fingers curled into a fist beneath her chin, she watches Kang Guillaume intently. Her mind is spinning. So, his name is Kang Guillaume? She muses, feeling a strange weight settle in her chest. Everywhere I go, everyone is talking about him. It's impossible to escape it. What she had witnessed was shocking. She still couldn't believe it. Kang Guillaume had sliced off Knox's entire arm with just 2 kitchen knives. The thought sends shivers down her spine. I prided myself on my knowledge of swords, she thinks, bitterness rising in her throat. After all, I'm the granddaughter of a swordsmith. But to think someone could be that strong with mere kitchen blades, I was naive. Her thoughts are interrupted by a sudden realization. Wait a minute, could he be the top student? Frustration bubbles up within her, and with a sharp exhale, she slams her hands down on the desk in front of her, her face flushing with a mix of embarrassment and anger. It's so frustrating that he's stronger than me. At that moment, Rachel, who had been sitting nearby and watching her friend closely, arches a brow and asks with amusement, What's going on, Abel Vaughn? Abel Vaughn quickly composes herself, her face softening. Oh, sorry, Rachel, it's nothing. But Rachel isn't fooled. She smirks, eyes gleaming with curiosity. Are you sure nothing's bothering you? She teases, nudging Abel Vaughn playfully. It's been a while since I've worked out, so I'm feeling a bit sluggish, Abel Vaughn replies, attempting to brush off her own frustration. Rachel narrows her eyes suspiciously, leaning in closer. What's going on with your face? You're acting weird. Are you hiding something from me? She laughs, her voice laced with playful mischief. In a more secretive tone, Abel Vaughn responds, What do you mean? Why would I hide anything from you? Rachel, ever relentless, presses on. Come on, spill it. I know something's on your mind. Abel Vaughn forces a laugh, but it comes out weak. She tries to laugh it off again, but Rachel isn't buying it. You must be hungry, she suggests with a sly grin. Let's get something to eat. What do you feel like having? With a tired sigh, Abel Vaughn responds, No, I'm not hungry. But Rachel isn't done yet. Have you not left your weapon behind? She continues, her teasing smile widening. No, not at all, Abel Vaughn insists, her patience wearing thin. Rachel, still persistent, jokes, So do you need to go to the washroom or something? Finally, Abel Vaughn snaps. Stop messing with me. I said there's nothing. But Rachel, grinning like a cat who's caught the mouse, leans in even closer. I've got it figured out. You're hiding something. I can feel it. Flustered, Abel Vaughn feels her resolve crumbling, unsure of how to respond. Rachel leans in with a mischievous look. I thought Abel Vaughn wasn't the type of girl to fall in love. Guess I was wrong. Tell me, who's the lucky guy? Abel Vaughn, her cheeks turning red, stammers, What? No, it's nothing like that. Rachel laughs wickedly. Come on, tell me. I'm dying to know. Who's the one that has captured Abel Vaughn's heart? As Abel Vaughn remains quiet, clearly uncomfortable, Rachel narrows her eyes playfully. All right, I'll guess. Is it Leon? He's quite handsome after all. Abel Vaughn quickly shakes her head. No, it's not him at all. Rachel, looking surprised, tilts her head. Well, that's weird. If it's not Leon, then who could it be? Wait. Her eyes light up. Could it be that special student from the fight? Abel Vaughn's eyes widen in shock. Rachel, grinning from ear to ear, practically jumps in excitement. Bingo! I knew it! She laughs, clearly pleased with herself. I'm really good at this. It was fun catching you like that. Before Abel Vaughn can protest, Rachel grabs her hand and pulls her up. Come on, let's go. Abel Vaughn tries to resist. What are you doing? Where are you taking me? With a teasing smile, Rachel replies, Let's go to the tiger class. The two girls burst into the tiger class, drawing attention from everyone present. Rachel makes her presence known immediately, her voice ringing out, We're looking for the black-haired boy. The students snap their heads toward her, jaws practically on the floor. Whispers ripple through the room. One guy leans over to his buddy and mutters, Wow, it's Rachel from the hero class. Another girl nudges her friend. Is that really Abel Vaughn with her? What's going on? A guy further back practically chokes on his drink. Holy crap! Abel Vaughn too? Unfazed, Rachel marches right into the center of the class, hands on her hips like she owns the place. All right, people, we're on a mission here. Where's the black-haired boy? You know who I mean? One student speaks up, waving a hand dismissively. Excuse me, I don't care how high your status is, but standing on someone's desk? That's a bit much, don't you think? Rachel, ever the queen of sass, shoots him a playful smirk. What, you don't think I look good up here? Look again. She strikes a pose as if she's on a runway. The guy's face goes beet red and he stammers, no, yes. Yeah, you look amazing. Abel Vaughn, standing to the side, palms her face in sheer disbelief. What am I even doing here? Some of the other girls in the class start whispering amongst themselves. You gotta admit, Rachel does look stunning. Rachel, all smug, grins as she scans the room. Her eyes lock onto a familiar figure, Kang Guillaume, slumped over his desk, asleep, like he couldn't care less about the chaos happening around him. She raises an eyebrow, thinking, is that his girlfriend? She glances at the girl sitting nearby, giving Kang Guillaume that loving gaze. But then Rachel shrugs. Whatever. Who cares? With a mischievous grin, she leans down close to Kang Guillaume and whispers in his ear, Hey, sleepyhead, rise and shine. Kang Guillaume stirs awake, blinking groggily as he lifts his head. He's immediately hit with a wave of confusion. What's going on? His eyes land on Rachel, who's grinning down at him like the cat that caught the canary. Oh, did I wake you up? Rachel teases, her tone innocent, but her expression anything but. Your name's Kang Guillaume, right? Still half asleep, Kang Guillaume looks around, confused. Yeah, I guess. Rachel straightens up, placing her hands on her hips. I wasn't told much about you, but after seeing that fight in the subspace yesterday, I just had to meet the guy who sliced through Nock's auditor like a sushi chef. She gives him a wink. Kang Guillaume, now fully awake, is still processing. Wait, Rachel's here? His intuition is on high alert. Something feels off about this. Before Kang Guillaume can reply, Rachel continues, her teasing in full force. "You're staring pretty hard at me. What's up? Are you some kind of perv?" Kang Guillaume's brain screeches to a halt. What the hell is this? His instincts scream at him, dangerous, super dangerous. Suddenly, Chloe steps in like a whirlwind, grabbing Rachel's hand in a flash. Her eyes burn with pure, unfiltered rage. "Who the hell are you, and what do you think you're doing?" The tension in the room skyrockets as Chloe's killing intent floods the space, the temperature seeming to drop by several degrees. It's clear from her expression that, if provoked, she might just rip Rachel apart right here and now. Rachel, still grinning, remains unfazed, but the class is dead silent, frozen in the tension. Both Abel Vaughn and Kang Guillaume are staring, eyes wide, wondering what's going to happen next. And just like that, bam! The chapter ends on a cliffhanger.
Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it and want to see the next parts, make sure to drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more awesome content. Until next time, take care and see you in the next video.